it's a pleasure for me to introduce Simon. I barely dare to tell in which circumstance I got to know Simon. Simon was applying for a fellowship in Switzerland, and I was in the committee who heard him talk, and that was the first time I discovered his work. And what impressed me is this combination of very theoretical linguistic, so something that is really, all about human language, and more human you can do, and trying to use this very theoretical concept to turn them around and see a little bit how does that happen in the broader sense and in animals. And so I think there is a dream behind. Perhaps we can start to have our books of our childhood be actually right, where we start to talk with animals and animals talking to us. That would be quite a dream. I'm not sure it's going to be true, but if anything can be done to go in that direction, is people like Simon who do it. So Simon, please tell us.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Eve, and for the opportunity to be here. I understand it's a very special meeting, so I really appreciate the invite. So what I'd like to do today is just kind of tell you a bit about what is arguably the most complex form of communication that we currently know of in the natural world, in the animal kingdom. I hope most people would agree with me about that, and that is human language, and how studying animal communication and taking a comparative approach can help us begin to unpack the evolutionary origins and the evolutionary emergence of the language faculty, which is something that has been shrouded in quite some mystery over the last few years and decades and centuries even. So that's generally what I want to do. More specifically, I'm going to start by trying to define what human language is and its core properties. So entire textbooks have been written about this. I've tried to capture this in a couple of talk slides. It's a bit of a challenge, but I'll do my best. I'll then move on very quickly to highlight an issue associated with studying the evolution of language. So why is this problematic? What is the impasse? And then how studying animal communication or taking a comparative approach can perhaps help us out here, help us out of this impasse. And then I'll kind of devote the rest of the talk to focusing on a core feature of human language, which is, of course, its semanticity, its ability to convey meaning or bear meaning, and what kind of comparative evidence there exists for this ability. So whether we see similar abilities in non-human animals, particularly in chimpanzees, and what that can ultimately tell us about the evolutionary age of semantics, and therefore, by implication, the evolutionary age of language itself as well. Okay, so what is language? So it's been suggested a number of times over the years that language really represents one of the core standout features of our biology, of our cognition, of our culture. It's something that kind of characterizes us as a species, maybe separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom. We might we'll see in a bit later whether that's the case or not, and is responsible for our ecological success today as a species. And I think an important observation is that as a species, we just seem inherently inclined or motivated or predisposed to try and engage one another in communicative interactions and share information. And I think this is beautifully illustrated by this YouTube video of these two pre-linguistic, non-verbal, whatever you want to call it. They don't have language yet, these twin boys, these identical boys, but they're still trying to engage one another in this communicative interaction and share information. And I'll just play that to you, hopefully. So I find amazing that no one really understands what these boys are saying, but it's been viewed, I think, over 2 billion times on YouTube now. So what is it kind of then that makes human language so special? So this is a question that scholars have been kind of grappling with and pondering over for the last, well, kind of 2,000 years even, since the time of Aristotle and Plato. Nevertheless, I think that most comparative psychologists and evolutionary language scientists and evolutionary biologists, cognitive scientists would all concur that whilst human language is this very complex, multifaceted communication system, there are still a few core components that when they come together, they make human language very special. And one of these that I'm going to be focusing on today is language's hypersemantics. So this is its ability to convey meaning, bear meaning, to label objects and events in the environment with signals, whether that's words or gestures. So I'll be focusing on this and then kind of searching for similar abilities in animals, specifically in chimpanzees, and then ultimately addressing the evolutionary implications of this. So natural questions that come out of the recognition of the importance of human language to us as a species and the importance of these kind of hallmarks to human language, such as semantics, but there's also other things like combinatoriality as well. Where do we get this ability from? And critically, is it unique to humans? And as Townsend pointed out in the 70s, I think it makes complete sense to try and interpret this question within some sort of evolutionary framework, because if we can understand its evolution, then ultimately we can begin to understand its uniqueness. But this is where the problem lies, and that is in comparison to other biological traits, human language is a bit problematic because it's a bit of a cliche, but there is some truth to it that it doesn't really fossilize. So language is an ephemeral trait. As soon as we produce it, it's instantaneously kind of dissolves or disappears into the ether, and that's the case for vocalizations and signals as well. So if we want to study its evolution step by step, then we have to come up with indirect ways to do this. And luckily there do exist some indirect ways. So whilst language itself doesn't fossilize, some of the anatomical structures that are necessary for speech and support speech do fossilize. So things like the hyoid bone, which is important in the placement of the larynx, but also the hypoglossal canal, which is home to the hypoglossal nerve, which is important in the innervation of the tongue and allows us to articulate the tongue and produce complex sounds. These sorts of structures do fossilize, so we can kind of look in the fossil record to see whether our hominid ancestors had these anatomical structures and therefore, by implication, potentially had complex sound production. But maybe this approach tells us a bit more about the evolution of speech and less about the evolution of language. We can also study child language acquisition, so children go from having no language to a full-blown productive linguistic system over a matter of months and years. And studying this transition can tell us something about the cognitive mechanisms necessary for the development and the ultimate instantiation of a full-blown linguistic system. Well, lastly, we can do what I do and what a number of people are doing at the moment, and that's take a comparative approach, and that's where we study the communicative and the cognitive capabilities of both closely and distantly related animal species in search of both the similarities and the differences between natural animal communication and human language. And if we can work out why those similarities and why those differences exist, we can ultimately begin to unpack some sort of evolutionary route or evolutionary path that culminated in human language. So that's kind of the comparative approach in a nutshell. For evolutionary biologists in the audience, you can take a brief snooze, because I'm just going to elaborate for people who are less familiar that there's actually two different forms of comparative approach. There's the homologous approach and the convergent approach. So the homologous approach is where we study the communicative and the cognitive capabilities of closely related species to humans in search of precursors to linguistic abilities. So this is just a phylogenetic tree of the primate lineage. It just shows how closely related different primate species are to humans. You can see that we last shared a common ancestor with bonobos and chimpanzees around 5 to 6 million years ago. Then further back in time, we last shared a common ancestor with gorillas around 8 million years ago. And then even further back in time with orangutans around 15 million years ago, and then with monkeys between 35 and 45 million years ago. And the idea here is that if we find the same trait in closely related species to humans, it's unlikely they possess this because they have independently evolved this ability. And it's more likely they possess this trait because all the species have inherited it from a shared common ancestor. So the beauty of this approach is that exactly by studying such closely related species to humans, we can begin to reconstruct the kind of cognitive and the communicative abilities of extinct hominid ancestors to humans, which is, I would argue, as close as we can get to kind of jumping in a time machine and going back in time and working out what they were capable of. So that's a homologous approach, and then there's the convergent evolutionary approach, which is where we study the communicative and the cognitive capabilities of distantly related animal species to humans, and here we're less interested in searching for precursors to linguistic abilities, and we're more interested in the kind of evolutionary or the selective forces that promote the emergence of these abilities in the first place. So the idea here is if we find the same trait in distantly related animal species to humans, such as dolphins, and humans, it's unlikely they possess this because they have inherited this from a shared common ancestor, and it's more likely they possess this because both species have been subject to the same sorts of social and ecological pressures that promote the emergence of this ability in the first place. And I would argue that actually both approaches are quintessential to the holistic understanding of the evolution of any biological trait, and human language is no exception there. Okay, so as I kind of mentioned already, the focus of the talk today will be on languages semantics, which is arguably the key hallmark of language, and we'll kind of searching to see what kind of comparative data exists in animals for similar abilities. So specifically, we'll be asking whether this ability is unique to humans or not. But before we can do this, we need to define what semantics is. So from a linguistic perspective, semantics is simply just a mapping of meaning onto signals. It's this ability to use signals to label things in the environment, use words to say, for example, chair or table in computer. From a more philosophical perspective, it's often considered as the link between human language and the external world. So there's a nice quote from Daniel Dennett, who some of you might know. He's a philosopher of language. And he says semantics is where the rubber meets the road, which is where two things connect, basically, where language gets all the way into the world and words refer to things and events therein. And it's exactly that, this mapping of meaning onto signals, that gives us this ability to refer to objects and events in the external environment. So I'm sure the burning question on the end of everyone's tongue right now is, well, is there any evidence for something like semantics in non-human animal communication? Well, it hasn't been an easy road today. Already in the 1800s, Muller said no process of natural selection will ever distill significant words out of the notes of birds or the cries of beasts. And it's been relatively recently echoed by Berlin in 2005, who says an alarm call is more like a scream than a word. So this is kind of a nod to the idea that animal vocalizations are maybe more similar to human emotional vocalizations, like crying or laughter or screaming, than they are to human referential words. Nevertheless, I think there is a solid community of researchers in the field of animal communication who agree that there exists convincing evidence that animals are capable of producing acoustically distinct vocalizations in the presence of specific external objects or events, such that these calls could really label these external objects and events in the environment. And the classic example, textbook example for this ability comes from the work of Cheney, Seyfarth, and Mahler back in the 1980s. He studied the Vervet monkey alarm call system in East Africa and Kenya in Amboseli National Park. And what they showed is that Vervet monkeys produce acoustically distinct vocalizations in the presence of different types of predators. So when they encounter aerial predators such as eagles, they give these vocalizations. And when they encounter terrestrial predators, such as leopards, they give these vocalizations. Hopefully, you can hear that there's differences between them, that you can see that there's differences between these spectrograms, which are just acoustic visualizations of the sound. And indeed, there are statistical differences between them. And the key thing here is that there's a tight mapping between the fine acoustic structure of these vocalizations in the context in which they occur, so that these calls only really occur when they encounter aerial predators such as eagles, and these calls only really occur when they encounter terrestrial predators such as leopards, such that they could then label these objects in the environment in a reliable way. And what was really seminal about the time about the work of Cheney, Seyfarth, and Mahler is that they came up with an experiment to try and test whether these calls are really meaningful to receivers, whether they convey information or meaning regarding the presence of these specific external threats, these specific external predators. And what they did basically is they conducted a playback experiment, which is where you record these alarm calls under natural conditions in the presence of predators, when monkeys find predators and they give these alarm calls, and then you play these calls back to them from their own group members, but critically in the absence of any kind of external threat. So what we say in the field is in the absence of the assumed or the putative referent. And the prediction here was that if these calls do really mean something like leopard or something like eagle, then receivers who hear these alarm calls should respond in the same way to these alarm calls as they would to when they encounter these predators under natural conditions. So when they hear leopard alarm calls or terrestrial alarm calls, they should have a chat message. You can't hear your computer. I think that was for the vocalizations. Okay, sorry.
That's live.
Yeah, exactly. So when they hear leopard alarm calls, the prediction would be that they should run towards trees and run up trees, because that's how they respond when they encounter leopards under natural conditions. And when they hear eagle alarm calls or these aerial alarm calls, they should maybe look up into the sky and run down the trees because aerial predators attack from above. And that's how they would respond to aerial predators in their natural conditions. And indeed, that's exactly what they found. And I just have a brief video to show you of a response to a leopard alarm call. So this is not from 1980. Obviously, the quality is very good. This is the BBC who came out to our field site where we work with Vervet monkeys in South Africa, the MCARVU Vervet project, which is in collaboration with Erica van der Waal, who's at the University of Lausanne. And we work on their vocal communication system there, and the BBC came out and they wanted to see some of these behavioral responses to alarm calls, and so they filmed. They asked us to record some vocalizations and play them back, and then they filmed this specific response to a leopard alarm call. So you won't hear the vocalization itself, you'll just see the behavior because it was filmed with a GoPro. So I'll just play it one more time. So they're just going about their daily business, foraging, and then the alarm call is about to start now. And you can see that they run towards the trees and run up the trees. Okay. But because at the time, the kind of cognitive mechanisms driving the production and the perception of these
So what did you do when you do the other call?
Then they would look up into the sky and run down the tree. They do exactly what you predict.
Okay.
Yeah. I just don't have the video to prove
Okay.
it. Yeah, so the cognitive mechanisms underlying the production and perception of these vocalizations at the time were unclear. The researchers who worked on these vocalizations and others kind of tried to keep some distance from human language, and rather than terming these monkey words or monkey semantics, they instead focused on the function of these calls, and the terminology was that they use, and it still continues is functionally referential vocalizations, because the function of the call is to refer to something in the environment. And there's now a whole framework that exists as a way to identify a call as functionally referential or not. So it's defined as an animal call given to a specific external event where the meaning of the call is understood by others, and there's production and perception criteria. So the production criteria is a specific acoustically distinct call made in a very specific context, and there should be a tight mapping between that acoustic structure and the context in which it occurs. And also perception criteria, so group members should behave as if this call is meaningful to them and really refers to that object or event with which it correlates or with which it occurs. And since that seminal work of Choni, Seifert, and Mahler, a whole number or plethora of studies have in different primate species, different monkey species, and ape species have since emerged, showing that primates are capable of producing functionally referential alarm calls, so acoustically distinct vocalizations produced in the presence of different types of predators, such as aerial predators and terrestrial predators, and also functionally referential food calls. So acoustically distinct vocalizations produced in the presence of different types of food, high quality food and low quality food. And this has been shown in different ape species, such as bonobos, chimpanzees, but also some monkeys. And it's this broad distribution of this ability across the primates, across the apes and the monkeys, the different ape species and different monkey species, that have led some to suggest that the origins of this ability is traceable maybe as far back as the last common ancestor of humans and monkeys, perhaps 35 million years ago. So maybe we can think of semantics, or references is just another term for semantics, as an evolutionary ancient ability. And of course, that's a tempting conclusion to make, but the killjoys amongst us would say this is perhaps an overtly romantic interpretation of the data, because actually all we're seeing is surface level similarities between these functioning referential calls in animals and human semantics, because human semantics, as it turns out, is actually a lot more than just the production of a referential word or a referential call. That's of course important, but we also have a degree of voluntary control over the usage of these referential words, and we direct them at specific individuals. So we engage in triadic communication with a signaler, a receiver, and a referent. And we also have a fine degree of control over the acoustic structure of these referential words. So that in human language, words are acquired socially within a community of language users. So if a child that's born in Switzerland grows up in Indonesia, it will learn the Indonesian word for apple because it acquires this word socially within this community of language users. So if we're seriously interested in the evolutionary roots or the evolutionary origins of semantics, then we also need to provide convincing evidence of these other additional criteria that characterize human semantics. So not just the production of a referential call, but also some degree of voluntary control over these referential calls and direction of these calls at specific individuals, and some degree of voluntary control over the fine acoustic structure of these referential vocalizations. As it turned out, there is kind of comparative evidence at some level for this. So we already talked about functional referential call. I've already explained that, but there is some evidence that different primate species have a degree of control over the usage of their social vocalizations, that they can maybe direct these social vocalizations at specific individuals. So that's been shown in baboons and chimpanzees. And that maybe they also have a fine degree of control over the acoustic structure of their social vocalization. So there's some nice work from pygmy marmosets and chimpanzees that shows that they're capable of tweaking the fine acoustic structure of their social contact calls to sound like or converge on the acoustic structure of their friends' contact calls. So that's all well and good, but as I kind of just elaborated, all of these examples really come from non-referential vocalizations, more social calls, so calls that are used to kind of maintain or control the underlying social dynamics of that species' social system, but that are not explicitly referring to external objects or events in the environment. And what's missing until recently, or relatively recently, is consolidation of evidence for each of these criteria, critically within the same species, but most importantly within the same referential call system. And that's what we've been trying to do over the last decade or so in the chimpanzee food call system. And that's what I'm going to be telling you about now. So we already know that chimpanzee food calls are functionally referential, so they produce acoustically distinct vocalizations in the presence of different types of food. So when they encounter high quality food, they give these calls. And when they encounter, they give these calls. So hopefully you can hear that one sounds more kind of pitchy, higher pitched, more tonal, more excitable. The other one sounds a bit like, you know, annoyed, but less interested, unimpressed. So there are acoustic differences between them. You can see visually on the spectrograms that they look a bit different as well, and indeed they are statistically different. There's also a type mapping between the fine acoustic structure and the context in which these calls occur. So these calls really only ever occur in high quality food context, and these calls only really ever occur in low quality food context. And there's also behavioral data and experimental data showing that these calls are meaningful to receivers, and that they do transfer information regarding the presence of high quality food versus low quality food. So there's a lovely study from 2005 from Katie Slocum and Klaus Zuberbuehler that shows that chimpanzees spend more time searching for food when they hear the high quality food calls, because they have a high preference for this food and they'll be willing to invest more energy to find it. So we know these calls are functionally referential, but what's been missing is whether the chimpanzees have a degree of voluntary control over the usage of these calls, or whether they are kind of just automatic reactions to the presence of food, whether they direct these referential food calls at specific individuals, and if they have a fine degree of control over the acoustic structure. To answer question 2 and 3, we conducted studies in the field in Uganda at the Budongo Conservation Field Station, and to answer question 4, we conducted a study at Edinburgh Zoo, and I'll discuss all 3 of these. So wild research was conducted with the Sonso community of chimpanzees in the Budongo forest, which is located here in western Uganda, close to the border with DRC. And at the time we did the study, it was home to around 70 habituated chimpanzees. They've been followed since 1990 on a daily basis, so they were very used to the presence of humans, and this ultimately meant that we could collect high quality behavioral and vocal data. And I just want to show you a video providing a glimpse into what daily life in the forest is like. So often it can be quite quiet and peaceful with just chimps going about their daily business, and then all hell can break loose because the dominant male is not happy about something. And this video kind of sums this up perfectly. So I don't know what to do about the sound, because there will just be echoing, but I can leave it on.
He's a musée.
any sense what provoked this?
No sound whatsoever. We don't know. He was probably when females have these reproductive swellings, and males just intimidate them on a daily basis until they mate with them. It's kind of the darker side of chimpanzee behavior, unfortunately. Okay, so the first question we wanted to answer is whether chimpanzee food calling is just an automatic response to the presence of food, or if they have a degree of voluntary control over the production of these vocalizations. So we followed basically 9 male chimpanzees through the forest for a year, for 12 months, and we recorded their feeding behavior and the calls they give when they encounter food. And what we found is that they only ever produce food calls when they find food. But the interesting thing was that they don't always produce food calls when they find food. So they actually produce food calls in around 50% of instances in which they find food.
Can I ask something? Or is
Of course,
yeah. Sort of. So when the alarm calls, it's kind of a shared interest. So there's a common danger. With the food, it's actually a much more sort of a subtle interaction between the individuals.
It depends on the food source. So some are more monopolizable and others are more shareable. So we do have data on the exact precise type of food, and maybe that's something we could talk about a bit after how that influences them.
And we could learn.
It's not something we've explicitly integrated here, but it is definitely something that there is a phenomenon that exists, that some food sources are more monopolizable than others, and others are more kind of shared between 2 or 3 individuals.
Okay.
How that influences the food calls, maybe we can talk about afterwards. So they seem to only produce calls in about 50% of these feeding events. So we wanted to know, well, why do they sometimes produce food calls and sometimes not? So we looked at a number of social and ecological factors, and what we found is that they were more likely to produce food calls when important social partners or friends were present. And this was measured through time spent grooming, which is this tactile behavior that chimpanzees engage in to remove ectoparasites from the hair and from the skin. And the more time they spend doing this, the closer the social bond between the individuals. So it's important in the formation and the maintenance of social bonds. So we found they're more likely to produce food calls when their friends or close social partners are present. We also wanted to rule out more simplistic explanations. So it could just be that the total number of chimpanzees that were present in the audience also had an influence on food call production, just like a basic arousal effect. The more chimps that are present, the more aroused they are, and the more likely they are to food call. But that didn't seem to influence food call production. It had a non-significant effect on the production of food calls. It also didn't seem to be the case that any important social partner is sufficient to drive the production of these food calls, because estrus females, who, as we just talked about, are also very important social partners for male chimpanzees, their presence in the audience didn't affect the production of food calls. So what we can conclude from these observational findings is that chimpanzee food calls are not automatic reflexive responses to the presence of food, but they seem to be produced, have a degree of control over them, and they're produced preferentially in the presence of certain valuable social partners.
Is it the more high-ranking males that produce these sounds, or the more lower?
So all individuals, it's mainly males, because males are more vocal than females generally, but high-ranking males produce food calls, low-ranking females produce food calls. But there is an effect on the rank of the individual in the audience as well. Yeah, it's a kind of a omnipresent behavior in chimpanzee, at least across the males. So what we have here is kind of correlation between the production of these food calls and the presence of friends. So we also wanted to try and establish if there's some sort of causal link between them. So we thought, well, the best way to do this is with some sort of experiment. And to kind of come up with this experiment was relatively straightforward. Conceptually, to implement it in the field was a complete nightmare. And I'll explain why in just a moment. So the concept behind it was simply just, why not simulate the arrival of a specific individual into the vicinity of where a male is feeding with a playback experiment, basically by playing back that individual's call. So simulate the arrival of either a friend or a non-friend and see how that influences call production. But as I said, to implement that was very tricky, because there's a number of requirements and criteria that have to be met in order to do playback experiments with a very socially intelligent and complex species like the chimpanzee, because we want to be very careful with simulating an event that's not really occurring, and we want to be careful that we're not playing around too much or disturbing the fine social fabric of that species. So in order to do a playback experiment, we first had to wait for a male chimpanzee to leave a group of chimpanzees and move around 35 meters away. So chimps are very social, so the probability of this happening is quite low. We then had to wait for them to start feeding by themselves and remain silent whilst feeding by themselves for at least 5 minutes. Now we know that chimps give food calls in about 50% of instances, so the probability of them remaining silent was 50-50. Once these two criteria are in place, we could send the speaker, which is concealed in this rucksack here, hopefully you can see that, in the direction of what we call the call provider. So this is the individual whose call we are playing back to this individual in the tree here. This is our subject here. And the reason we sent the speaker in the direction of the call provider is because we think that chimps have a pretty good idea where other chimpanzees are in their community at any one point, and we wanted to make sure that if we play back this call from this individual, it's in a direction that is congruent with where that individual is actually in the community at that any point in time. So we sent the speaker in the direction of where the call provider was. We find the call provider and then we'd say, okay, speaker team now go southwest. And they have to maintain at least 300 meters distance from the call provider, so the call provider would not hear his own call being played back to the subject. It never happened, so we don't know what would happen if it did happen, but we just wanted to avoid it happening personally. And we also had to make sure that the speaker was around 40 meters from the subject individual, so he could hear the vocalization but couldn't see what was going on, and couldn't see that there isn't a chimp there. So once all these things were in place, we could start filming and recording and do the playback. And it's kind of quite liberating when 18 months of blood, sweat, and tears can be condensed into one graph. But basically what we found is that our subjects are significantly more likely to start calling at the arrival of an individual who was a closely bonded social partner. So on the x-axis here, you have whether they called or they didn't call, and on the y-axis here, so when this individual called or didn't call, and on the y-axis here, you have the composite friendship index, which is a measure of how friendly the subject is with the individual we were playing back. And hopefully you can see that in all the instances in which they called, the friendship index, the relationship strength between these two individuals was always significantly higher. Okay, so what we can conclude from this observation and now experimental data is that chimpanzee food call usage demonstrates more similarities with human reference than previously assumed. So the call is functionally referential. We've known that since 2005. It's produced selectively, so they have a degree of voluntary control, and they even seem to direct this referential food call at specific individuals. But what's been missing is whether chimps have a degree of control over the fine acoustic structure, and that's what we've been doing most recently. So we wanted to know, do chimpanzees have any control over the structure of their functioning referential food calls? So I already kind of mentioned this earlier, just a bit of background. There is some work suggesting that the structure of some existing calls in primate repertoires can be modified. So are open to vocal learning processes, that's what we kind of term it. And the most convincing work is contact call structure in pygmy marmosets and chimpanzees can be altered to match that of their close social partners. I already mentioned that. Primate functionally referential calls, on the other hand, are generally assumed to be quite fixed in their acoustic structure and determined by underlying emotional or arousal processes. So the idea here is that when a chimpanzee finds high quality food, it just finds itself in this very specific emotional state that gives rise to a very specific excitable food call structure, and they cannot decouple these two things. And that would mean that these kind of calls are therefore not open to any kind of vocal learning and could not be subtly changed or modified. And obviously this would also represent a huge difference from human semantics or human words, because for me to say the word fire, I don't have to be stressed out that there is a fire. I've seen a fire and I'm stressed out by that fact to produce that word. We've managed to decouple our underlying emotional arousal state from the acoustic structure of the referential semantic words we produce. And this is arguably one of the most important steps in the emergence and the evolution of full-blown semantics in language, this decoupling of underlying arousal state from the acoustic structure of the words we produce. So we wanted to investigate this question and see whether these food calls are really under some degree of voluntary control from an articulation perspective, from an acoustic perspective. So we took advantage of a really unique opportunity where one group of chimpanzees was moved from the Netherlands to Edinburgh Zoo. So this is an unusual event because chimps are highly territorial. And so normally zoos just move one chimpanzee at a time. That takes a lot of work to integrate that individual because it's just like bringing a stranger into the group. So kind of trying to integrate a whole group of chimpanzees into another one is just, well, I don't know why they decided to do that, but they did. And what we noticed is that before integration, the two groups had differently structured calls for the same food, for the same reference, particularly apples. So Scottish chimpanzees did not like apples at all and produced calls that were commensurate with that. You can hear those differences and see those differences. So we were kind of interested, well, what happens when the two groups come together, when the two groups socially integrated? And what we predicted is that if chimp food calls are open at some level to vocal learning processes, then as the two groups become more socially integrated, then maybe we should also see some sort of convergence in the food call structure, as has been shown in other more social vocalizations in primates, and potentially as a way to actually facilitate or aid that social integration as well. So we collected data over 3 years, before integration in 2010, 1 year after integration in 2011, and 3 years after integration in 2013. And we took a number of, we performed acoustic analysis, so we took a number of acoustic parameters from the vocalizations from these food calls as a way to capture or describe the shape of these food calls. So both frequency-based, so pitch and time-based measurements. And then we boiled all these acoustic parameters down into a single principal component that basically just captured the structure of that vocalization. And then we performed all our, I won't go into details here, but our statistical models on that principal component one. And we were specifically interested in the interaction between group and year on the acoustic structure on principal component one. We also conducted social network analyses based on association index data, so how much time chimps spent with other chimps in the groups as a way to track social integration over time. And we also wanted to try and rule out that any change in the fine acoustic structure of these calls was not just a product of changes in preference for the apples, that maybe just one group started to like apples more, and that's why their calls changed. We also used objective food preference hierarchies as a way to track the preference for not just apples, but all their food that they were fed.
Well, even apples can be quite different.
Different types of apples, like Granny Smith.
Yeah.
This is true, yeah. And actually, someone has genuinely forwarded that as an argument for these results, but I'm not sure they're different enough to drive such substantial acoustic differences in the call. But again, we can maybe talk about that afterwards. So just to come to the results quickly, so we know that already pre-integration, the Dutch chimpanzees really liked apples and produced food calls that reflected that. The Scottish chimpanzees did not like apples at all and produced calls that reflected that. And 1 year later, in 2011, the preferences remained the same. Scottish chimpanzees still didn't like apples. Dutch chimpanzees did, and the calls had remained the same. They hadn't changed at all. So there was no evidence that anything like call convergence or vocal learning and calls and preferences remained stable over this year, despite this exposure to this different calling culture for two groups. But this sort of made sense when we looked at the social network analyses. So in 2010, the groups are highly modular. So the strength of relationships between individuals in the same group was higher or stronger than the strength of relationships between individuals in different groups. So you get this modularity appearing, basically. So you can consider them as two different groups. And the same was very much the case in 2011. So some between group bonds had actually started to be formed, but on average, the strength of bonds between individuals in the same group was greater than between individuals in different groups. So we could still consider them here in 2011 two different groups of chimpanzees. But we persisted, and we went back 3 years later in 2013, and we looked at the preferences. Scottish chimpanzees still did not like apples. And Dutch chimpanzees did like apples, still at the same rate or at the same level, with the same preference. Scottish chimpanzees produced calls that were commensurate with that dislike for apples. And now they've changed the sound. So just to kind of explain the statistical effect we found a significant interaction between group and year on the acoustic structure on principal component 1. So basically the effect that year had on the acoustic structure differed between the groups. So hopefully you can see from these lines here that to the light blue line is the Scottish chimpanzees, and hopefully you can see over the 3 years the acoustic structure didn't really change much, it more or less remained flat. Whereas for the Dutch chimpanzees, to begin with, they were acoustically distinct from the Scottish chimpanzees. So you can see here the line starts here, and there was a significant difference between the calls produced by the Dutch chimpanzees and the Scottish chimpanzees in 2010. But over time, they changed the acoustic structure of their calls to converge on the Dutch chimpanzees. So Dutch chimpanzees shifted both the frequency and the temporal structure of their calls to match the Edinburgh calls. And when we looked at the social network data, this seemed to make sense again. So in 2010, they were highly modular, but in 2013 we couldn't find any meaningful subgroups anymore, and the chimps had actually integrated and formed strong cross-group relationships. So the media obviously loved this story and picked up on it a bit, and some were more accurate than others. So the NZZ in Switzerland did a great job. Actually, the Daily Mirror, which is notoriously a terrible tabloid in the UK, actually did quite a good job as well. They said Dutch chimpanzees learn to speak with Scottish accents, which is, I mean, that's not exactly what we said, but it's close enough. New Scientist, which is generally quite a reputable popular science publication, got it completely wrong. So they said, meet and hear the world's first bilingual chimps, which is exactly not what we found. Okay, so just to conclude this last study, what we've shown here is that the acoustic structure of these referential food calls in chimps is not fixed and can change independently of the preference for the reference. So hopefully you remember that the preference for apples in the Dutch chimpanzees remained high over the 3 years, but the acoustic structure changed. So the acoustic structure is not tied to the underlying emotional or the arousal state of chimpanzees. And the adult chimpanzees are able and motivated to modify their functioning referential calls to match those of close social partners. Why they do this, we don't really know at the moment. We can speculate, but this is just an N of 1. It's just one instance where one whole group of chimps has been integrated, and the fact that they had differently structured calls for the same referent was also unusual. So we're waiting for another event so we can try and replicate this work, but the probability of one whole group of chimps being integrated with another is quite low, but who knows, maybe in the future. But of course, we can kind of make some hypotheses. It could be to aid social integration, as has been shown in other social vocalizations. It could also be to facilitate comprehension. So just the idea of the different individuals in the same group producing differently structured calls for the same food, it's just not really a stable communicative system. So maybe the incoming group, we can stay with the immigrants, maybe they're the ones who change the calls to converge on the home group, the Scottish chimps. So just to bring all of this work together, hopefully what I've managed to show you is that functional referential calls seem to exhibit more similarities with human referential words than previously thought. And the implication of this, the evolutionary implications, that semantics and particularly the cognitive building blocks underlying semantics might actually be evolutionary more ancient, such that the kind of last common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans, who was roaming the plains of Africa 7 million years ago, was capable of producing functionally referential vocalizations, was capable of directing these calls at specific individuals and having a degree of fine control over the acoustic structure of these vocalizations. And hopefully, yeah, the kind of take-home message is that hopefully I've managed to convince you that studying primate communication, primate vocal communication, can help us begin to reconstruct how old features of human language are, such as semantics, and therefore by implication, how old the language faculty proper is. And with that, I would of course just like to thank my group in Zurich and other funding agencies and agencies involved in the field station in Uganda, you for your attention, and yeah, I'm happy to take any questions.
But the genetic information about that, you can also trace something genetically. Which gene is responsible for language? If there is some genetic impairment, or if people can see which gene, how particular genes correlated to the language abilities, and can trace their evolution.
So it's a question whether there's like a genetic signaling. Right. So I think this is quite a controversial area in language sciences in general. There is some work looking at the extent to which there is genetic signals for linguistic abilities, but it's quite controversial work. No one's looked at the moment at kind of genetic factors or yeah.
It's not individual gene, probably several.
Yeah, of course, yeah, it will be there surely be interactions between genes. Right. There is some work starting to look at the like sequencing the genome of specific individuals and then trying to find kind of correlations between certain behaviors in chimpanzees I'm talking about, and maybe that work is slowly reaching to communication. But there isn't, as far as I'm aware, there's no work showing that there is some sort of genetic driver of surely there is, of course, but we don't have any work on that. Yeah.
Well, this can be traced evolutionary, right? We can imagine which gene eventually went to develop.
Oh, well, actually, no, sorry, yeah.
It didn't come from outside, it was already there.
Yeah, no, I said that, and I should contradict myself, because there's been a whole body of work on one very specific gene called the FOXP2 complex. And people have implicated this in the evolution of language. They've shown that there's been very important changes in the structure of this complex of genes, or this gene, in our recent evolutionary history since we diverged from chimps. So maybe then that is responsible for our language abilities. And there's also work in humans showing that people who have a faulty FOXP2, I think it's a HOX gene, have problems with the production and the comprehension of language. But actually, it turned out that this is more correlated with just cognitive function in general and not language specific. And the idea that there would be a single gene responsible for language anyway is just probably really misguided. And now I think, yeah, there has been work in birds as well, showing that if you play around with that FOXP2 gene, you can change. It's like if you upregulate it or change the expression, you can change song production. But I think it was once hailed as the gene for language, and I think people have now moved away from that and are kind of more interested in this. There's a special term for it where you just do kind of genome-wide GWAS. I think it's you do genome-wide sequencing and then look for correlations. But yeah, surely there is some sort of genetic signal. But of course, the social environment and culture also plays an important role in language acquisition. Yeah. Yeah.
So I suppose you cannot do experiments with this animal group sort of for ethical reasons.
Yeah.
But could you sort of venture and hypothesis what would happen if you now play the Dutch word for apple to this current group?
So if I played the previous call that they produced for apples back to them now, whether they would know. I mean, it's been that was 2013, so it's been almost a decade. This would be a great study to do because it would kind of investigate a number of questions.
Because if I listen to them, it's kind of a sort of also even we can hear some difference between these.
They surely can as well, yeah.
So
the question is now whether they're so it's so entrenched, that new call in the system, that if they hear that high pitch call,
whether it's sort of associated with apples, so there's some more general.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Or whether they would not be expecting to find apples if. Okay. So it would be, there's a number of ways you could test this, like with a violation of expectation experiment where you play back that call, but you don't leave apples, and then they should be shocked, and then that would show that they still understand that call means apples. Okay. But yeah, because it's been quite a long time, we're not really sure. They definitely have long-term memory, so they definitely remember the calls of individuals over time.
It's about 2 generations or something.
Yeah, well, I mean, no, because they have offspring once every. I mean, there's long interbirth interval as well between different offspring, so it's I mean, 9 years is still quite a long time in a chimpanzee's life, so it's a fifth of their life basically. So, but it would test that, but it would also test their long-term memory, whether they can.
Well, I can't understand my own kids at the moment. So.
I feel your pain. Yeah. But yeah, no, we would love to have done more comprehension-based experiments at the time with the Edinburgh chimpanzees, but we weren't allowed to do those back there. I mean, actually, logistically, running them in captivity is maybe sometimes easier than in the field, because you know where everyone is. You don't have to find them first before you play back these calls. But just some zoos are not so open to the more experimental methods that we use, so it's fine. Yes, yeah, Mark.
Just because it's on this same question about the apples, is that call apple specific, or is it a high quality food, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, so it's most likely a high quality food call, like a generic one for high quality food, and apples was one of their few high quality foods. So, but we have done follow-up work to see whether they have food item specific, if there's like systematic acoustic differences in the calls produced to different high quality foods, basically. So like I say, like mangoes and apples would be 2 high quality foods they would like. Can you find an acoustic difference between those calls produced? And there is some evidence to suggest that. So that would be even closer to the referential nature of human language, because we don't, of course we have words for categories of things, but we have very specific words for very specific things as well, like armadillo.
And then I wonder if you have an idea of why the preference between the two populations is so different in the first place, and why the preference would be resistant to social integration, whereas the reference is not.
Yeah, again, I think it would be, if we could replicate this, we could begin to answer these sorts of questions. So why the preferences are so different, and then subsequently the acoustic structure of the food calls after. We don't know. So it could be because the type of apple they were fed, a very specific brand. But it could also be that maybe the Dutch chimpanzees were spoiled. Sorry, the Scottish chimpanzees were spoiled, and they got lots of kind of which can happen in certain zoos. So then apples for them, even though they're kind of sweet and fruity, they just won't fall.
But post-integration, they're eating the same apples, presumably, right? So
Yeah,
the preferences would convert if it was explained by the variety of apple, you would expect
Yes.
the preference to convert.
Yes, true. Yeah, because the Dutch chimpanzees would have also been spoiled as well. Unless then the kind of variety of foods they got after integration wasn't the same as what they got before.
They did remember their preference.
They what? Sorry.
They did remember their preference.
Yes, they did maintain their preference. Yeah, we were just saying like if in the situation where if it was to do with being spoiled, then Mark's point was that then you wouldn't see that change. But maybe then because there were more chimps, they didn't have the luxury of it all gets very speculative, but they didn't have the luxury of providing them with all these different types of. I think Scottish chimpanzees are anyway just a bit odd, so maybe that explains it because, and that's not because they. So most chimpanzees have, I think, a high preference for these rich and sweet food types such as apples. And the Scottish chimpanzees, their favorite food was bread. And I haven't heard of that in other chimpanzee communities. So it could just be that they were deviant somehow, the Scottish chimpanzees, and then that explains it. And then the change in why the preference didn't change as well. I mean, the work that exists already suggests that when they're in terms of facilitating comprehension, the thing that seems to change is the acoustic structure of these vocalizations. So that's why we kind of predicted and focused on that. Whether you would also expect the arousal state or the preference, which is driven by the underlying arousal state, to converge as well as the two groups become socially integrated. I'm not sure if there's any kind of data suggesting that already in primates or in humans. Actually, when humans become socially integrated, do they converge on similar arousal states? Maybe.
Food preferences, I would imagine that they do. I mean, I don't know about the arousal stuff.
But the underlying, we talk about the food preference, the preference of the food being driven by the arousal state, which is just more excited about, and that's what drives your. Those two things are quite correlated, or are correlated. But food preference within the community would. I think we just need to replicate the work if we can, and then see whether this is just something unusual about this situation where the call changed but the preference didn't, or another situation where the preference changed and the call wouldn't. I think it's an insightful study, but it needs to be followed up. But,
I was thinking that maybe the zoo was a bit more alienating. I mean, I know it's a very human notion, but in a way, the situation of the zoo could change things, and so maybe the chimps would, in general, throughout the board, be less excited, and so.
Yeah. So if that is the case, so when the Dutch chimpanzees moving to Edinburgh, for example, it's just a different environment. People afforded that alternative explanation as well. So there was a bit of a rebuttal in the journal where people wrote a commentary and then we had to rebut it. I think they also mentioned that it could be the context or the situation that's driving it as well. But I think if that was the case, then why would we probably expect them to have changed quite quickly as well, the rules. So within the first year, you would maybe expect it, because it's such a drastic change for them. Then if it's going to change, it would change then, and not 3 years later. It was just what we found most striking was that it correlated with the integration of the two groups together. I agree that there would be unanswered questions if just the food calls had changed, but we didn't have any data on how socially integrated they were. But it was the fact that we found this cross-correlation between the social integration and the acoustic integration, acoustic convergence, which seems to suggest that only when the two groups become a single group and become socially integrated, then do we find this convergence in acoustic structure. You haven't asked the question yet.
So I thought to remember that there are some level of mind theory in chimpanzees, right? And therefore the ability to trick others.
Yeah.
Is this a good paradigm also to study whether vocalizations can be manipulated, right? In an intentional manner? Is there anything like that observed?
Yes, there is. Yeah, there is work showing, I think, that capuchin monkeys will produce food vocalizations when they're, or alarm vocalizations when there are not predators present, but when there is food present. So almost as if to kind of pretend or to deceive other conspecific, other group members into thinking there's a predator present, and so that they then have full access to the food. There's some issues with that, so I can't remember quite. And there's also quite there's also some anecdotal work in vervet monkeys as well and other species that, yeah, again, they seem to. And baboons, there's a classic example where when a subordinate is being chased by a dominant, then they will produce an alarm call, for example, even though there's no threat present, and then the dominant will think that there is. And so people have argued that this suggests there is some mind reading, some theory of mind, basically, that they understand that the dominant will think that there is. So it's about attributing mental states and these sorts of things to other individuals. They'll think there's a predator present, they'll stop chasing, and it does indeed happen, but it happens so rarely to record it in a systematic way. But you would maybe expect that anyway. It's like a frequency dependent behavior, not to do it too much, otherwise they stop believing you. Don't cry wolf, basically. But yeah, I mean, we've done some work on how intentional vocalizations are, and deception is one way to look at that, because of course human language is fully intentional. It's not just voluntary control, but we want to inform other people about things, and we inform them if they are ignorant about things. So we do definitely do this mental state attribution.
If I go on the internet, it's not quite so. But,
so according to the internet,
if I go on the internet, it's not quite.
What's not?
Well, people try to inform me of things, but I'm not. They're not trying to help me most of the time.
Yes, it can also be used maliciously, I think, language or information.
That's probably the distance between, but
yeah,
if you are close to the
kind of face-to-face interactions, or within our kind of social groups, I think we very much do that. So you can use examples of deception to show that there is some sort of control and understanding of others' minds, and the change in usage of these calls to influence that. But you can also there's also other what we call markers of intentionality that have been developed from infant communication in humans. So different kinds of criteria that if you see that when animals produce signals, you can make the argument they're intentionally used. So things like they only vocalize or give a gestural signal when there's an audience present, like social usage is one main criteria. Another would be that they pay attention to the attentional state of the individual. So they look to see whether the individual is looking at them when they vocalize. Do they elaborate if their message is not received? So if they give a vocalization, the individual doesn't behave in the right way, do they then give it again? Do they elaborate on it? Do they give like more extensive vocal signals or gestural signals? These sorts of things. So there's other ways to do it, because just these deceptive events are so rare, but they certainly do tell us something about the usage, the voluntary usage, and the cognitive mechanisms driving the voluntary usage as well, which is very important. Yeah.
Are these deceptive events specific to particular individuals, or it's across? Yeah, they're sneaky.
One super smart individual who's figured it out.
Well, they're sneaky, or
sneaky,
amoral, or I'm not sure where you want
to. I don't. Again, there's just not enough data on it to kind of isolate whether it's specific to an individual. I think what people have done or should do, if they haven't done it yet, is try and bring together all these examples from the different species and see where the similarities and where the differences are. So even though there are anecdotes in that single species, if you have enough examples from enough species, maybe you can start to ask systematic questions. And I think that would be important. Yeah.
You would imagine that those deceptive approaches are generally more from younger individuals toward older than vice versa.
Like in kids, or
yeah, I think among humans, we know that we tolerate way more.
Yeah.
From children than from adults.
Yeah.
Well, but we have criminals and non-criminals too. That's why I asked about individuals. I mean, this is an expression of something in the personality, possibly, not just age.
No, but I think if you want to have something more frequent, probably I would imagine that we tend
for the more frequent.
Yeah, we would tend to be more tolerant towards our children than our peers, right?
Yeah, I mean, definitely younger individuals do make mistakes when they're giving alarm calls, but that's probably because they're still learning the usage context. So like vervet monkey juveniles or infants will sometimes give an aerial alarm call to a falling leaf, for example, from a tree, because they just see something in the sky and they freak out. And then over time, they hone that and they streamline that usage so that it's only produced in the right context. So you could maybe interpret that as deception if there was the right surrounding context that would support that. But I think, I mean, maybe also lower ranking individuals, you maybe would expect to be more sneaky, maybe engage in more deception because they have to kind of employ these tactics to navigate their complex social world, whereas dominants can just be brash and kind of smash things and not care what other individuals think. So
chimpanzee groups are not so large normally.
It depends on the community. So on average, there are, I think, between like 70 and 90 individuals in a group. But there's one group, the Ngogo community in Uganda, which is 200 chimps. It's the biggest community we know of.
Vervet monkeys?
Vervet monkeys is probably between 20 and 30. So monkey
Okay,
groups
they're
are
really
generally
distinct.
smaller. Yeah. But it also depends on the ape species. Like mountain gorillas, for example, live in very small harem-like communities. Yeah.
Now, I was wondering to what extent sort of the social context would allow conditions that allow individuals to develop a secret code in their communities.
Yeah. So maybe there definitely is work suggesting that the more socially complex a species is, then maybe more vocally complex they are as well. What we mean by vocally complex is up for discussion. It could just be the number of calls they give or how they use them. But there is definitely, and that's kind of going more in the direction. This work is all about how old these abilities are. And of course, another important question is why have these abilities evolved in the first place? And what were the selective forces that promoted them? And that's where you need data from more distantly related species, as I mentioned. And we've done work in these species as well, and that seems to suggest that actually cooperation is probably a major driving force in the evolution of complex communication. So humans are highly cooperative. We have the most cooperative species. Like we cooperate on the highest level. We make promises and pacts.
We're also quite competitive.
Sorry, we're also very competitive. Yeah, of course. But if we were chimpanzees, we would all be dead by now because we would all attack each other. We can sit in a room or on a bus without ripping each other's arms off. Chimps can't do that. So something's changed since our last common ancestor with chimps. And it could be that we've become more cooperative. And when we look in species that are distantly related to humans that are more cooperative, some of these bird species we work with, and also these cooperative non-primate mammal species like meerkats, and so they seem to have even more complex communication systems than maybe chimpanzees. And the thing that unites all those species together is that they seem to engage in cooperation. And that's a pet theory in the field, that cooperation drove language, but having systematic data that supports that from distantly related species is missing, so we're trying to put that together as well.
So would then bonobo be more
right? Yeah. So people have there's been I think a grant from a colleague of mine was interested in comparing the kind of cooperative proclivities of bonobos and chimpanzees. So on average, bonobos should be more cooperative than chimps. That's a bit of a myth, but there is some truth to it. And then also comparing the communication system as well. To be honest, I think the idea that bonobos are more cooperative than chimps is maybe a bit of dogma in the field. So I don't know really what you could extrapolate from that sort of research, but I think on average the communication systems are very similar. Bonobos do maybe sequence calls a bit more together into larger structures, which is reminiscent of what we see in language. But again, the critique we always get in this situation is one species versus one, and what you should do is ideally find a species that is highly cooperative and look at their vocalizations, and then find a kind of a closely related sister species that is not cooperative at all. And I think the distinction between chimps and bonobos is not that great. They're framed as being competitive, but they can also they cooperate to hunt. We've got a paper coming out in a month's time showing that they use vocalizations to coordinate their hunting behavior. And they cooperate with territorial patrols around the community. So they're very kind of petty. So they are very competitive in that sense, but they also do cooperate. And bonobos are cooperative, but they're also quite competitive like chimps. Yeah, it's a good question. Okay.
So if I remember correctly, there was this famous anecdote, I think, from Jane Goodall about at Gombe, about sort of lower ranking male that learned to use the empty fuel cans from the research camp to intimidate the more dominant males. Yeah. And so and then maybe this would be unethical to pursue, but I just wonder if you could put a chimpanzee chimp into a sort of a much more complex environment, right, with more stimuli and more objects and more complexity in general. Do you think that you would see them developing, innovating new communication techniques?
That's a good question. Yeah, how you would do that, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe we have enough. I mean, your point would be to actually take one chimp and put it in another one, but another way to do this into another community, but another way to do it this would just be to compare different communities and look at their structuring, whether it's social or kind of materialistic, what's around them, these sorts of things, and then compare their communicative strategies.
I'm thinking more of manipulating at the troop level, either in captivity or you actually just enrich their environment.
Right. So ethically, that would be tricky to do, of course. I mean, you mentioned that you could maybe in a captive setting, like just provide them with more things, more enrichment devices or whatever, and see how that starts to influence their behavior. But of course, it's always that our understanding of the evolution of this behavior is limited from captive work, so it's better to do it in the wild. But that's where I thought maybe we have, like, I think on a total now 10 or so different chimpanzee communities where there's research being done, and if we could lump them into sufficiently different sorts of kind of structured groups, and then start to look to see how that is influencing, are some groups just on average a bit more complex in their strategies, or do they do, like, what was it about the Gombe community there, the Kasai-Kala, whichever it was, that drove him to do that? Was it just specific to that individual, or was it something to do with the community itself? Like, they didn't have those things around, would you have found something else to throw at the other chimps? It's all a question of what data we can get from the wild and what kinds of things we can do in captivity. But I think playing around, there is work in non-primate species showing that where we work with some species where you have access to a whole population of that species, and they exist in multiple groups. In the meerkats, for example, we can study 20 groups of meerkats. So with that sort of sample size, I mean, I know for you guys, that sounds small compared to what you work with, but then we can start to ask more kind of objective and systematic questions. And there is work showing that I think cognitive skills vary as a function of the social complexity of the group in which you are from. So in Western magpies, we work with them in Western Australia. If you come from a big group of Western magpies, I think your short-term memory or long-term memory is better, or you're better at solving certain cognitive tasks than in species that in individuals that come from smaller groups. So there's the idea that, again, social complexity is driving cognitive complexity in kind of real time in a current population of individuals as well. Yeah.
The talk is all about common ancestors, and so the precursors in the common ancestors. And I don't know if you have a pet theory about what changes as we diverge from chimps.
Yeah.
Later on, that launches language and culture alongside. But I guess one idea is that maybe that their environments are so simple that they just they've come up with all the good ideas, right? That they've saturated the innovations, and so the innovations just don't come as quickly enough to chimps or in general to drive these things forward.
Yeah, actually, I think I'm most convinced by these are all just so stories, and it makes it difficult to kind of convince people of these things, or they're, like you say, pet theories. But I think the one I'm most convinced by is this idea of that it's cooperation that has driven what we see, what makes us human. So cooperation not only makes us human, but it might have given rise to all the other aspects that make us human, like language. And what we can say is that humans are, without doubt, cooperative breeders. So there's the adage or ode, whatever, it takes a village to raise a child, and it's true. Like the interbirth intervals we have, you can some people can have a kid, 6 months, a year after or so since their first one. That's only possible if you have help from other individuals. And so we are. Some people find it. Some people don't completely agree, but we are cooperative breeders in the same way that other species are cooperative breeders, like meerkats or pied rattlers or dwarf mongooses. These are the species we work on. And chimpanzees are independent breeders. It's just the mother raises the offspring. No one helps. Like even the dad doesn't care. And so that means that the last common ancestor of chimps and humans was most likely more similar to chimps than they are to humans. So they would have probably been independent breeders as well, which suggests that when you add cooperative breeding to a chimp-like cognitive system, it somehow it gives rise to this explosion in behavioral and communicative complexity. And that is, I think that's a
yeah, but it's because the ecological conditions where chimpanzees
of course it's not just that's driven it, for sure, but it's certainly perhaps one standout selective force or change, in at least one that we can kind of pinpoint, something that's changed since we last had that. You're right. It's this perfect storm where all these selective factors have come together at the same time, and that's given rise to, and just the chimps are, they're people often ask, well, if you left a chimp for a long enough time, would it evolve language? And I think that's an interesting question. I think
But if you remove the humans,
I think the answer is always I can't, you don't know, and it's unlikely because it probably just was in our evolutionary history that this very specific suite of selective conditions that is unlikely to come together again. I mean, it depends how long you leave it, would ever give rise to this trait again. So it could really be that we're stuck with this n of one, and we have to do the best with it that we can. Yeah.
So I guess those vocalizations are very sophisticated in many ways, and so the subtleties that might exist or might not, it's very difficult to figure it out, right? Are there possibilities of using artificial intelligence and all these deep learning methods to try to dig in to see whether there is more to be understood?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. The problem is, I think, as far as I understand, with these deep learning unsupervised or supervised approaches, is that you need quite a lot of data to train the models, the deep neural nets or whatever. And we lack the data from an animal communication perspective. Yes, maybe we have 5,000 vocalizations, but if you compare that to the sorts of data that they use to train models to learn human speech, it's orders of magnitude smaller. So it's we have done some work. Actually, we have a preprint out there which has applied a machine learning and a deep neural network model that has been trained on 10,000 human voices, and that generalizes really well to chimpanzee vocalization. So it's been trained to differentiate between individuals and humans from the voice, differentiate between different latent emotional states, these sorts of things. And if you then give it chimpanzee vocalizations, it can zero-shot learning. So you don't have to train it at all. It's never experienced a chimp vocalization, and it can also already say these are different individuals. It can kind of cluster them based on ID, and it can cluster them based on call type as well. And that's probably because the anatomy of the vocal production apparatus, or the structure of the vocal production apparatus, is very similar between chimps and humans. And so it would be interesting to take another species like bonobos, where they're very high pitched and more like bird-like, and see if we get the same sort of reliable classification. But actually, I submitted just the consolidator, SNF consolidator grant, to try and use in the field machine learning approaches in a kind of diarization. I think that's a terminology-based way where on an iPad you would be in the field, and with this machine learning model, which has been sufficiently trained, it would be able to tell you from out of sight vocal interactions who that individual is and what the vocalization is. And I think that is, at the moment, our understanding of chimpanzee social complexity is hindered by the fact that we can only look at what we see right in front of us, and so many of their decisions are controlled by out of sight vocal interactions that we don't know what they are or what they mean, but they do. And if we could keep track of those with some sort of kind of more fine-grained analysis approach that outcompetes humans, like a machine learning model, then we might be able to tap into that hidden.
Knowing what this particular individual that you are hearing is very important, of course. But there's also you want to know what this individual is trying to convert.
Yeah, but that's why with this model we could arguably tell from outside vocal interactions who that individual is and what the call type is, and the call type gives us a good proxy of what they want to communicate. So if it's a food call, they're trying to communicate the presence of food. If it's
but then you need a common language.
Yeah, but we know the repertoire of chimpanzees. So we've known for like 60 years now that they have roughly 15 different types of calls, some of which grade into others, and we know very clearly what context these calls occur in. And so we obviously can't communicate with them, but we roughly know when they are communicating with each other what they are trying to convey. And some of these calls are referential, some of them are not. That's another thing. Yeah.
You make this distinction between referential calls and non-referential calls, but it seems to me that, I mean, even in human speech, it's very few calls that have no emotional value to them. Maybe some robot-generated voice has no emotional value to it, but even when you said fire, in a way, there was this contradictory spirit when you said it. So there is some emotion attached to it.
Yeah, no,
So
definitely.
I don't see how strict this distinction is between referential
Yeah.
calls and non-referential
Yeah,
calls.
that is maybe a bit of an oversimplification for the purposes of today, and you're absolutely right. You hit the nail on the head. There is a bit of a dichotomy. Well, there's been a lot of discussion as to whether we should kind of frame this in this dichotomous way, where you have referential versus non-referential vocalizations. Of course, all vocalizations have encode some sort of emotional information in them. So does human language. You know, when you say fire, you're encoding the external event, but also how you say it encodes, and it's kind of this dual level of encoding. We have this, but I think there is something to be said of making a distinction between calls that are very obviously referring to something in the external environment and calls that, so like chimpanzees, for example, maybe have a scream, you know, the scream vocalization. This is not really, this is about I'm scared and I'm announcing that I'm scared because I'm being attacked, but it's not trying to say Jeff is attacking me. It's not about what's happening external to them, it's just what's happening to them itself. And I think it's just a good place to start. It's a necessary groundwork that we want to do if we want to compare human language with animal vocalizations, is rather than taking these very subtle, nuanced social calls that we're not totally sure on what the meaning is, let's go with the really obvious calls where it's quite crystal clear that this food call is only ever produced in food context, is produced in the presence of an external object, and they understand that they extract the meaning regarding the external object from these calls. And then we can see where the similarities and differences are, and then of course we should extend that to other call types. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't. And there are some social referential calls as well, so just to kind of make that distinction between reference versus social calls is wrong, because there's hand-grunt vocalizations that chimps give when they want to be subordinate to a dominant individual. And maybe we haven't shown this yet, but it might be that when they encounter higher ranked individuals, the pant grunt changes in its acoustic structure. It sounds even more like they get even more stressed out by it. And if there's systematic differences there at play, then maybe as someone listening could hear Jeff or whoever the individual pant grunting is pant grunting to a high ranked individual. So they could extract some external information from that vocalization. So it's like I said,
I was almost thinking that in a way, when I say the shout of I'm scared,
yeah,
is almost also referring to myself. So in a way, these shouts would be self-referential.
Self-referential, yeah. I think so. Some people say reference is everything. So reference can be about yourself, it can be about things that are external to you, and then there's the more kind of hardcore people who are like philosophers of language, or people in animal communication as well, who say, let's first focus on the calls that are very obvious referential, in the way that armadillo is got nothing to do with me. It must be about something external. So I think we need to. There's some work in dolphins, for example, that shows that they have these signature whistles that they give that kind of just announces themselves. And people have argued that that's referential because it's like using a name for yourself, basically. So different dolphins have differently structured whistles, and other individuals can tell from that whistle that who that individual is, and other individuals can use the whistle of another dolphin when that dolphin's arriving. So they'll kind of name that dolphin with and this is maybe somewhere like at the interface between calls that are referring to oneself, but also something external at the same time about who you are. So yeah, it's a bit of a semantic, kind of, to use a wrong word, it's a bit of a semantic issue what we mean by reference. Reference is about semantics, so it's
I was almost thinking, but isn't that all the problem of your field, in a way that you have to define language with language?
Yeah.
And that it's that you keep stumbling on that problem.
Yes. Yes. So again, that's a big area of controversy in the field, whether we should be kind of couching animal vocalizations in this linguistic framework or not. I don't know what the solution is, because
you could have answered.
Just grunted back at you. I'm genuinely interested in whether traits or hallmarks of human language exist, whether they are in the same form or more they're always going to be in more similar forms than other animal species, and I think that's a legitimate question. Of course, there's the danger that you start to kind of overinterpret or anthropomorphize, that you know, it looks like semantics and we're getting closer and closer, but maybe it's not. Maybe it is something totally different. And we need to also look at, if we really want to nail semantics, then we know that in human semantics, when we process words, we have an intermediate mental representation. I mean, you don't think about it in real time, but you engage a mental representation about that thing. Like if you say tree, you'll have some sort of tree-like image in your head, probably. The question is whether animals also do that. And so maybe if they're just processing referential calls and are kind of based on the underlying arousal state that's communicated through that call, then it's not the same as semantics. But there is work showing in chickens even that they have basic nominal representations. There must be some sort of an intermediate mental representation that is driving the processing of these vocalizations. But again, it makes sense to start with truly referential calls in the system to then test whether the mental representation is driving the processing of these calls rather than these ambiguous, vague, subtle, non-semi-referential vocalizations. Just to make our job a bit easier.
No, yeah, of course.
If there's any questions that others maybe one in the chat. If there are questions from the audience, please unmute yourself and ask away. Yeah. I think there is anything else.
I think we should clap.
But anthropomorphism can help us a long way, right? Obviously, we need to test it afterward to verify that. But I would assume that first, I would say that pretending that there is no anthropomorphism elsewhere is actually very anthropocentric.
Yes.
That's true.
But also that making an hypothesis, anthropomorphism can be a very useful way to generate hypotheses. Obviously, we have to test them afterward, and that's a difficulty. But I assume that is a very useful tool.
I agree, and I'm glad you said that because most people are very adamant that anthropomorphizing is a huge issue.
I mean, it's going back to what you were saying about science yesterday, right? It's not about being objective; it's about testing.
Yeah, right.
The value.
Even for viruses, anthropomorphizing is a useful conceptual tool. No question about it.
Yeah.
I think, and in a similar way, anecdotal observations. People say you have one observation of something that you can't do anything with that, but you can use that to generate a testable hypothesis. You know, with an experiment, you can start to do these things. So, I think there should be a number of ways that we generate these hypotheses, and I think anthropomorphize. I think the issue that people have is that it's just some people use it genuinely because maybe for this reason. Or they want to, they're genuinely convinced that there are these similarities between humans and animals, and you can use those terms. And then other people use it simply to sell their work better. So kind of ascribing abilities to animals that are similar to humans, sells quite well with certain journals. Unless you have, I think people always say, bold claims require, solid data sort of thing. If you don't have that to back that up,
Strong evidence.
Then one should be careful. And people do get, when we make these sorts of, when we publish this sort of work, it gets a lot of, every other paper there's a rebuttal from people saying that's not right, or for this reason you shouldn't have said that, and these sorts of things, and it really ruffles people's feathers. But that's a part of the field as well, I think.
But it is very anthropocentric, actually, at the end.
Yeah.
And perhaps this is something we should be more aware of.
But that's because I want to know specifically. It has to be, I think, by definition, anthropocentric. Or you mean what is the people saying
that you cannot make these and these claims because this is not human.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to postulate at some point that even if clearly there are some discontinuities, there are also there is a lot of continuity as well.
Yeah.
I mean, we did not arrive directly from the head of Jupiter.
No, right, yeah.
Talk for yourself. Talk for yourself.
So in the 50s and 60s, there were all these experiments where people tried to teach chimpanzees language using symbols, plastic things, or whatever. And they seem to suggest that chimpanzees have the capacity to deal with the concept of verb.
Yes, the 8 language projects, there's a number of them. Some tried to, like Vicky the chimpanzee, they tried to teach how to actually say words, and that was just terrible. I spent 6
No, but
years.
I mean more the concept of
No,
a
I know,
verb.
yeah. And then there's been a whole bunch of work since, like looking at some symbolic understanding and symbolic abilities. And we actually work with Kanzi. I don't know if you know this language trained bonobo, who's like, I was saying to Consuelo last night, he's the closest we have to a celebrity in animals. He's the most famous animal, I think, apart from Alex the parrot, who was this very smart parrot. Kanzi the bonobo has been trained to use a lexigram system, so these arbitrary symbols that refer to different things, and he can use lexicograms that refer to actions, so things like chase he can use. So whether he understands the difference between a noun and a verb, like a naming word and an action word.
Is there any suggestion that chimpanzees use concepts like verbs among themselves?
Not in chimps, but we've got work that I can't show you today, but we've got work in meerkats actually. So this showing that they have these functions. They have one of the most complex functional referential alarm call systems that we know of. So they give aerial alarm calls, terrestrial alarm calls, high urgency aerial alarm calls, low urgency aerial alarm calls. So they have this dual encoding of emotional information and referential information in the same call. But they have this other alarm call type that's not produced in the presence of different types of predators, but instead it's produced when these different objects are moving or not.
Oh, wow.
So we call it the animal moving call. So they only seem to, and they produce in lots of different contexts when like springbok move through their environment, or when a meerkat group is running past, or when a dog, a predator, like a dog that can be a predator, is moving, then they give it. And the thing that unites all these contexts together is that something is moving.
Just moving.
And so we've recorded this, and we've done playback experiments, and we can show that they pay attention to wait. If you just play the moving call by itself, they kind of look around to see. But if you prime them with something that could be moving, so if you show them like I had a dog on a leash that I took to the meerkats, and we kept him still. And then we played the moving call, and they would really get, once they'd seen the dog, they would really get quite concerned when they heard the moving call, because they knew that there's something in the environment that could be moving. So it suggests that they understand that it refers to movement at some level. But if there's no threat around and you just play moving, they'll pay attention, but they'll be like, well, I haven't seen anything that could be moving, so it's not a big issue. And that's sat on my postdoc advisor's desk for 10 years now. So it's one of those long papers that maybe cut that from the so yeah, I think it's great data, but in chimps I don't think there's anything similar to that at the moment. But that's why I think this comparative data is so important in distantly related species.
The thing is that they seem to have the mental capacity to deal with these concepts, but they don't use it to communicate.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. So it's possible that from a comprehension perspective they are smarter than from a production. There just isn't the motivation, it seems, and maybe that's something
they don't need it, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. That's something that really makes humans and chimpanzees and other ape species or other animal species a bit different. Is that we're motivated to communicate. We have this pro-social motivation to tell other people about other things. Maybe on the internet, not so much, but and animals don't seem to have that same level of motivation to share, this willingness to intention to share. Yeah.
What about sign language? Because obviously you're talking about vocal language, but essentially there's also referential signs and gestures.
In animals, you mean? Or so I mean, sign language, and obviously in humans is a whole other area of research, but it's fully fledged language and everything. There's no question about that. There is some work on referential gestures in animals. So the most convincing one I know of is this beckoning gesture that bonobos give. So males will sometimes give this gesture like this when they want a female to sneak off with them for a sneaky copulation. And people have argued that's like an iconic gesture, an iconic referential gesture, because the movement mimics the meaning of the gesture. So like that would be an iconic. I always do this gesture and people don't know what I mean, but that's a rabbit, for example. That would be an iconic gesture for the rabbit. And they argue that this is an iconic referential gesture, and they're telling the other bonobo, come over here, and the movement of the whole gesture reflects that. The problem is with that, some are super obvious, and then some of the other instances they have are really like subtle, like they just move their hand like that. And so it's quite anecdotal, it's not super. And then another one is this, in chimps, there's a referential scratch where they do this big loud scratch. And after they do that, another chimp is more likely to groom in that area where they scratch. So it could be that they're saying, scratch me here, groom me here, which is like referential gesture to that area. But it's difficult to rule out that it's not just stimulus enhancement. So by scratching there, they're attracted to that area. They look at that area and then they think, oh, I'll groom there, but they're not grooming there because they understand they've been pointed to, directed to. But yes, there is work looking at that, and but I would say that the evidence for referential gestures is less convincing than the referential calls.
Can they understand if you point, can you teach a chimpanzee to if you point to something that their attention to go
Yes,
there?
in captivity, they do that all the time. Yeah, so that's a huge difference between wild chimpanzees never point and do not understand what pointing is. Captive chimpanzees who interact with humans and on a daily basis, the humans like, no, the food's over there. They learn to use that gesture. They don't really use it themselves, but they understand what the gesture means. As an example where they can learn to associate meanings to things, but then the kind of production is limited at some level.
I'm skeptical of this idea that they have like all this cognitive or conceptual capacity around that they're not using. So I kind of think they have to be using it for something, and then it's getting repurposed to do things like that. But
no, they are using it, but more to ascribe or assign meaning to things or to associate things together. But then they are then not kind of implementing what they've learned into their own production system.
Yeah.
I mean, so you like chimps learn in captivity that when a human points there, but when they want something, they should then point if they can then kind of implement what they've learned from the comprehension perspective into their own production system, but they don't seem capable of doing that. There seems to be a bit of a disconnect between those two systems at some level. Even if the motivation is there to do it, they won't just get their hand up and point, but they will understand that what pointing means, which is it's a bit of a conundrum.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
I leave the Zoom. Can I leave the Zoom meeting? Do you think? Or
Yeah.
I have to go.
Really fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.